Hello guys, today we are going to do Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. We will be covering three very basic things in FRBM. The first being what is FRBM Act, the second is why FRBM or the need for FRBM in Indian economy, and the third, how does FRBM aim to improve fiscal situation? How does FRBM function? The need for FRBM and what is FRBM Act? To come to the first one, what is FRBM Act? FRBM Act is a legislative measure binding the government to pursue a prudent fiscal policy. So it is a legislative measure which means it was passed in the parliament as a law in 2003. It binds the government to pursue a prudent fiscal policy. What do you mean by a prudent fiscal policy? It means reducing its fiscal and revenue deficits or bringing them under the stated targets in order to ensure stability of the economy in the long term. So this is the main objective or the main feature of FRBM Act. It was passed in 2003 with the following targets. What were the targets? Zero revenue deficit by 2009 and 3% fiscal deficit by 2009. So these were the initial targets. Zero revenue deficit and 3% fiscal deficit both by 2009. There are certain exceptions to FRBM. When can it not be followed or when may it be breached? So the deficit may exceed the target on two major grounds of national security, natural calamity. These are the two major grounds, but there is a third ground as well, or such other exceptional grounds. So this gives an open window to the government. It can bring anything under an exceptional ground and call it a calamity or an exceptional or an abnormal situation and exceed the target. So this is a problem with FRBM, that it opens or leaves open space for the government to decide as to what is exceptional ground. But for now, the deficit may exceed the target on these three grounds: national security, natural calamity, and such other exceptional grounds. The targets were first laid down in 2003, then they were revised in 2009 or 8 due to global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was, as you know, a major problem for the world, and the government had to follow a fiscal expansionary policy. That is, it had to increase money supply in the economy by giving jobs, coming out with jobs, coming out with infrastructural development in order to boost the economy, in order to boost up the economic growth in the economy. And so the targets had to be revised. Now, the need for FRBM. Why do we need FRBM? Four major things: to remove fiscal obstacles to monetary policy. Now, to understand this, let's assume that the fiscal policy is expansionary for a very long time. So, if there is a large amount of fiscal deficit or revenue deficit in the economy, and the inflation is also going up. If the government is following an expansionary fiscal policy and the RBI wants to control inflation and problems of high money supply in the economy, it will come out with its own dear monetary policy. But that dear monetary policy will not be effective, or will be effective to a very limited extent, because of the expansionary fiscal policy that the government has been following. So, in order to remove these fiscal obstacles and in order to allow the monetary policy to be effective, the FRBM had to be brought in place. The second is intergenerational equity. What does uh, deficit mean? It means that the government is borrowing, or the government is spending more than it earns, and thus the government has to borrow in order to finance its needs. So it brings in debt for the economy or debt for the government, which has to be served through interest and through principal payments in the future. Now, if the government is borrowing very heavily, if the government borrows very heavily, yes, if the government borrows very heavily, then it may have an impact on economic stability for the future, because borrowings for today will hamper the government's borrowings or the government's revenues tomorrow. If the government borrows very heavily today, then the future government has to pay high interest and principal repayments, and its limit for borrowing for taking debt also reduces. Thus, in order to maintain intergenerational equity, FRBM had to be brought in place. Maintaining solvency of the government, very important. The government cannot borrow indefinitely. As we saw in the Greece financial crisis, the government was borrowing very heavily and way above its credit worthiness, and that is what brought the crisis. So, in order to ensure that the government does not borrow above its means or above its credit worthiness, FRBM had to be brought in place so that the government remains solvent, or the government uh, does not become bankrupt, so to say. Therefore, FRBM was brought in place. Now, the last one is long-term macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability requires sustainable growth and a sustainable level of inflation. Now, if any one of this is hampered, then the stability is affected. So, long-term macroeconomic stability requires these two, and FRBM ensures that the government does not borrow above its limits, which will bring more growth, but which will also bring hyperinflation in the economy and affect macroeconomic stability. Therefore, in order to make both of these sustainable in nature, FRBM contributes by putting limits on the government. This is the need for FRBM. How does FRBM ensure accountability? Now, the third point. How does FRBM work? Now, there are four statements presented in the parliament by the government every year along with the budget. What are these four statements? Medium term, there are two medium term statements: medium term fiscal policy statement and expenditure framework statement. They can be understood from the name that has been given to them. Fiscal policy statement: what is the fiscal policy of the government? Expenditure framework: how does the government plan to spend money in the future? Fiscal policy strategy statement: what is the strategy of fiscal policy by the government in the future? And macroeconomic framework statement: what is the macroeconomic framework for the entire country, which has been talked about in the budget? So, a statement concerning that has to be given. These four statements are to be laid. Remember that this statement, the second statement, was brought in through an amendment. I'll talk about this in the next slide. So, originally these three statements were required to be laid down, but now the four statements are required to be laid down along with the budget. Secondly, how does FRBM ensure accountability? Ban on deficit financing. What is deficit financing? Before 1997, the government could borrow indefinitely from the RBI. If the government asks the RBI to give it money, the RBI had to either print money or issue securities in the name of the government and collect money from the people and give it to the government. That was called deficit financing. The government had no liability towards the RBI and it could borrow indefinitely. This was stopped in 1997 through Ways and Means Advances. Now, Ways and Means Advances puts a limit on how much the government can borrow from the RBI. This is an important piece of legislation or important piece of provision which came about in 1997, and FRBM also ensures that Ways and Means Advances is followed and thus ensures or brings about accountability of the government. Now, finally, very important amendments to FRBM. On recommendations, there were two pieces of amendments brought about recently. First, 13th Finance Commission, and then the Finance Act 2015. 13th Finance Commission recommended some changes, and those changes were brought about in the Finance Act 2012. What were the changes? Let's have a look at the changes. A fourth statement called Medium Term Expenditure Framework. This I talked about in the previous slide. Medium Term Expenditure Framework statement had to be laid down in the Parliament, the fourth statement which was followed. And then the concept of effective revenue deficit was introduced. Now, you must have heard about this term effective revenue deficit. Let me tell you what it is. Effective revenue deficit is revenue deficit minus grants for capital asset creation. The government gives a lot of grants to the state governments and to other organizations for capital asset creation. Whatever grants, not loans, whatever grants it gives to the state government or any other organization for creating capital long term assets, that is removed from revenue deficit. It was before included in revenue deficit, but now it has been removed. Why has this been done? One major reason: India is still a developing nation. It does not have a lot of capital assets being created. So, if the government has the target of revenue deficit going 0%, its ability to give grants for capital asset creation reduces to a very large extent. In order to ensure that zero revenue deficit target does not hamper the economic growth of the country or development of infrastructure in the country through grants for capital asset creation, this change was brought about and the concept of ERD was introduced. It was introduced by the present President of India, Dr. Mukherjee. Uh, he was the finance minister at that time. What is the third? What are the other major amendments brought about? It said that the revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and ERD to be eliminated or to be reduced by March 2015. That was the original target in Finance Act 2012. But these were further changed, these were further revised because the government was finding it very difficult to follow these targets. So the target of effective revenue deficit has now been extended to March 2018. Remember, it needs to be eliminated by March 2018. Now the target of revenue deficit is not strictly followed. In place of that, effective revenue deficit is the one which is being followed. The second target is target of 3% fiscal deficit by 2017-18. Remember this? The target was 2016-17 before, now it has been changed to 2017-18. All this has been done in Finance Act 2015, that is the last year's Finance Act. Problems with FRBM. Now very important, it can be asked in the exam, what are the, or it can be asked in the interview, very good question as to what are the problems with FRBM, because everybody keeps talking about good things about FRBM. It is widely considered as a law without teeth. Why is it considered as a law without teeth? Because number one, there are too many escape routes for the government. As I discussed in the first slide, it says that the government can extend the target or exceed the targets of deficit when it's about national security, natural calamity, or such other exceptional grounds. So the word such other exceptional grounds gives escape routes to the government and provides it's an opportunity that it can exceed the targets under FRB. The second is absence of independent committee to oversee its implementation. The implementation is done through the finance ministry itself under the budget, and there is no independent committee which oversees its implementation. So if there is an independent committee, it will pressurize the government, pressurize the finance ministry and the finance minister to implement the FRBM Act whenever it senses that the targets are being violated or the targets will not be reached in time. So due to absence of an independent committee, there is no regular accountability over the government to fulfill the FRBM Act. So these are the major problems with FRBM. Now let's take some questions. I've introduced this because I see that if we discuss 2 or 3 questions, then it provides you an idea as to what kind of questions may be asked. The first question is, the FRBM Act targets to eliminate effective revenue deficit and reduce fiscal deficit to 3% by the year. Now I discussed this in the previous slide itself, that the FRBM latest targets have been revised, and it tries to reduce, it talks about reducing the effective revenue deficit and fiscal deficit by the year 2017-18. You may get confused between 17-18, 16-17. 15-16 can be eliminated, but then you will get confused between these two, and some students may also find it difficult to eliminate this one. So remember this, 2017-18 is the revised target. Second question, what does FRBM stands for? It's a very interesting question because normally people think that they know what FRBM stands for, but when you have statements in front of you, you tend to get confused. Financial Responsibility and Budget Management Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, Financial Responsibility and Budget Measures Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Measures Act. I hope you get the answer right. The answer is Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. Now, fiscal and financial are very close terms of what FRBM stands for, so you may get confused. So try to remember the exact names. These kind of questions are normally asked in the exam, and they tend to confuse you. Last question is, which statement is not laid before the parliament under FRBM? Very interesting questions. Try to remember all the four statements which are laid down before the parliament. Medium term financial policy statement, medium term expenditure framework statement, fiscal policy strategy statement, and macroeconomic framework statement. The answer here is, which is not laid, is medium term financial policy statement. The correct statement is medium term fiscal policy statement. Try to remember all the four policies, all the four statements which are to be laid down in the parliament.